Hi, Alex.
Hi, Antonella. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. Happy 2026.
Yeah, happy 2026. I'm excited to be back and talking about dairy and dementia.
Indeed. I feel like this,
Yeah, it was a big
I
headline.
know, I feel like this would have been a good December one, given all of the
Yeah,
exposure to socializing and whatnot and cheese and charcuterie plates, which we've already joked about, and
yeah,
all of that. But I think it's just as good for January.
totally. Yeah, and it was a big
It
headline
was.
at the end of the year, and so we knew we wanted to talk about it. And so the headline, I think, pretty much read high-fat cheese and cream reduce dementia risk. So it sounded really good. I texted you like creme fraiche for the win.
Yes. Yeah, it sounds awesome. Who doesn't want to hear
Yeah,
that
but
news?
totally. But I think we're gonna see how it's like very much not as exciting as it sounded.
Mhm.
Okay, so maybe let's set up what we were looking
Yep.
at, and then we'll jump into
Our
our sort of unfortunately criticisms.
Yeah, I mean, the end result is just kind of underwhelming. It's not like we're like, oh,
Yeah,
wow, the study was totally wrong. It was just headlines often, not surprisingly, don't tell the whole story or they overstate the fact. And that definitely was the case here. Or can I pull out my joke? I didn't share my joke.
please.
It sounded too good to be true. Yep. So
Nailed it.
it was
Nailed
too
it.
good to be true. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yes. So the study itself is called High and Low Fat Dairy Consumption and Long-Term Risk of Dementia. It was published in Neurology in December 2025. And like all, or not all, but like many nutrition-based studies, it was an observational study, which means that they took a group of people and they looked at them over time and then eventually said, how many things were going on many years later, and then tried to see if there was a link between what
Yeah.
happened many years before and what happened many years.
Oh, Alex, you went on mute. Pardon our technical difficulties.
But like
I
I
don't know.
didn't touch anything.
No, I think it's self-muting. So I'll just remind you if it happens again.
No. What the?
But it was just that little bit. You
Okay.
caught it very quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, it was just that tiny little bit. It was just, yeah, it wasn't from the beginning.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I will not let you talk like forever on
Okay.
mute.
Thank you.
Promise.
All right. So I'm not sure where I was, but I was just talking about the observational studies, right?
Yes.
Nutritional observational studies, as opposed to randomized controlled trials. So there are some inherent challenges with observational studies, but also with nutrition studies. They're often observational because we can't lock people into a room for years and make them eat certain things just to see if they develop dementia over time.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And plus, dementia is something that would take a long time to develop. So you can't, on top of that, close somebody in a room for 25 years and feed them.
That's exactly right. And that's
Mhm.
the study looked at a 25-year span of time, which is the whole point that observational studies allow for these like extended periods of time. So in this particular group, it was a group of people from what's called the Malinois diet and cancer population. They were interviewed between the years of 1991 and 1996, I think.
Mhm.
So there
Yeah.
were, I think, 20 plus thousand people in this group. And so they did nutritional, like interviewing in three different ways during that period of time to get a sense of what their daily diets were. In this particular study, they were looking at the dairy product
Mhm.
intake. Um, but the interviews, of course, went through everything because these cohorts are used for lots of different studies. And then fast forward 25 years, and they look at how many people had dementia, and then they try to see if how much dairy was had in different categories, low and high fat dairy products in categories of like cream, cheese, milk, yogurt, that sort of thing,
Mhm.
and compared to each other, and then dementia rates. Do you want to give us a sense of what they found? We're doing this sort of backwards from usual,
Yeah,
but do you want to give us a sense? Yeah.
totally. So I think those was maybe the first area that was super underwhelming. Like when we started to go back and look at like what was significant and what actually showed results, it was like actually very few things. But the main one being that those who ate greater than 50 grams of high-fat cheese compared to less than 15 grams of high-fat cheese had a 13% less risk of all-cause dementia.
So, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
So I was going to say, I mean, the conclusion that taking in higher fat cheese reduced dementia rates is indeed what the study found.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
there are lots of questions here, right? And it certainly wasn't an across the board. They looked at other things like butter, and the high fat cream results were not as clear cut, although there were some aspects that suggested that having greater quantities of high fat cream versus less quantity of high fat cream may also have an impact. But it wasn't as clear as with the cheese. But there was no such relationship with the, like what they call the fermented products. So like the dairy, for example, or sorry, the yogurt, and no impact with the milk. And really important to note that doesn't mean that it increased dementia risk. It's just that it was neutral. There wasn't any relationship between whether it was high fat or low fat or quantities therein. The cheese was definitely the one that stood out of like, yes, if you had greater amounts of high fat cheese versus less, you saw this reduced risk of dementia over a 25-year period of time.
Yeah. And to say, because it's observational, right? Again, it's like not causation. It's not because of the cheese people had less dementia. It's just we see these two things to be true. They're statistically significant. We don't know why. We don't know if it's going to hold. And then this is like where all the commentary comes in, where it's actually like doesn't give us a lot of super meaningful information. But before we get into all of those, maybe we should also conceptualize that the 50 grams compared to the 15 grams. Because at 15 grams, it was a half an inch cube. And then the 50 grams was about 2 1-inch cubes. So really like a small amount of cheese here that we're talking about. Not even a full serving, which I think a full serving of cheese is like 100 grams or something. Like
it certainly 50 grams is not above and beyond in any way, shape, or form what people might be normally having in a day if they're cheese eaters, right? And so it also begs the question of how relevant is this in the long term, right? Like who are we asking people who eat less cheese to eat more cheese? But really, if you're a non-cheese eater, there's probably a reason for that. Like it's just those amounts are not that useful.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. And so I think jumping off there, I think our first sort of area was that this was an observational trial, which we've done other observational trials that have been much better. I feel like the conclusions we've been able to draw from them are more substantial. But in this case also, right, they were doing food diaries for 5 years in the 90s and then jumping up 25 years. And there's sort of this question, like, what happened in those 5 years, was that constant for those other 25 years, which is sort of imperfect data, right, from food frequency. Like, I do not remember what I ate a month ago, much less 10 years ago.
Yeah, and that's always the problem with these studies, right? And I mean, they don't have billions of dollars to be able to do it differently. I think that's often the criticism with nutritional observational studies in particular, but these things are expensive. And so they do what they can, and these are validated tests. It's not like they're just like guessing at how to do this. In this particular study, they did look at that nutritional intake in 3 different ways, including an in-person interview that lasted 45 minutes to an hour to like confirm the data. But to your point, the biggest missing piece is if you were eating this way 20 years ago, are you still eating this way now? And as we get older, some of you may recognize this. We may choose to eat differently because we are becoming concerned with certain aspects of our health and may make different decisions. And so that is what's inherently called a confounding factor. It's one of many that are offered up here as potential confusion-inducing qualities, right?
Yeah.
But we don't know. We don't know how many people would have changed their diets 10 years in, 15 years in, 20 years in, and does that skew the results one way or the other? I mean, you could make the
Mhm.
argument that everyone is doing that. So whether you're eating high fat or low fat, you may go in opposite directions, and maybe it's a wash in the end, but it's a big assumption to make. And it is one of the concerns with this type of study for sure.
Yeah. And then I think the other piece that we talked about a lot was how like complicated food is, and in particular cheese. Like we think of it just as dairy, but I think it's also fat, it's also protein, it's also calcium. And so it really isn't clear here from like what about the cheese is moving the needle? Like, is it the high fat aspect of the cheese? Like on the surface, it seems like it's that, but butter wasn't good for you, which is all fat. Um,
Yeah,
and then we don't know that it's the protein really, because there was protein in yogurt or would have been protein in the fermented foods, for example. And so it's like not clear what it is about the cheese.
right. And we can't also say, because we did see some signals in the cream, so we can't say, well, is the cheese super magic somehow? Even though it has this really interesting food matrix, is often how it's described, this like specific food matrix, this interplay between the fat, the protein, the calcium, the other minerals, the other vitamin, the other just like nutritional compounds, fermentation products, like all of these different pieces that maybe do interact in a really unique fashion. But because we also see some risk reduction less clearly in the cream, which is a completely different set of like interactive compounds,
Yeah.
then how do you draw a conclusion from that? And that's the magic and the frustration with not just dairy products, but cheese in particular. And I know there was discussion around like, well, maybe it is the fat, but it's like fat that's trapped in a certain way. And there's like this globule conversation, which we had a conversation about because Antonella has done some a little bit more digging for other presentations that she's
Mhm.
done, right? So all to say that there are some special things, but this is certainly not telling us that is it the special things and what special things, if any, could be making the difference here.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think, like, when we read the headline, where our mind goes is like, "Oh, if I wanna prevent dementia, I should eat cheese." Right? And so I think we're just strongly feel that that shouldn't be the conclusion. This might start to open up the conversation that cheese is different than what we expect. It's not all bad. There's more to it than just dairy, but it's still just, like, the beginning of that conversation building, I think.
Yeah, and this isn't the first study of its kind, but
Mhm.
it is still in the early days of trying to figure this stuff out, and that's the genius of research, and one of the reasons we wanted to start these conversations, because it's not one study that tells you everything you need to know about a topic. It's one thing that adds to the general bulk of evidence. And are you seeing these things pile up in a certain way? And the more studies that are done about this, the greater clarity we will have about the relationship between just dairy products in general and certain outcomes like diabetes, which we've talked about before, or
Mhm.
in this case, dementia, and if there are certain dairy products that have certain relationships there. But this is not, this is just a cog in the wheel, right? Like
Yeah.
a step along the journey, which is super interesting, but isn't like, okay, now we have all the answers. And this is when we talk about like takeaways, we've done this before. Like, what is our clinical takeaway in practice? And other than saying, like, there's nothing here to make us worried about cheese. And I think we see people maybe who are concerned about dairy intake more than in other healthcare offices. There's certainly no concern about dairy and dementia. It's just that it could be neutral or it may be helpful. And
Yeah.
we're just learning more.
Yeah. Totally. Totally. Um, and I think the high fat cheese, there was something that like the study did try to control for variables, right? So they like controlled for BMI, they controlled for smoking or non-smoking, exercise, alcohol intake potentially, right? There were lots of variables that they tried to control for. But even within that, there's stuff that you don't know that might just be traveling along. And so the high fat cheese, we're not sure if maybe it's a proxy actually for socioeconomic status, right? Like people who are spending money on high fat cheese might come along just with other health enhancing behaviors that we haven't been able to account for in those variables.
Yeah, there's some discussion around, the having greater amounts of high fat cheese may be an added expense to the grocery bill. And so are those people who are having greater amounts of that higher socioeconomic strata? And if that's true, like you said, what other things come along with that? Do they have better access to healthcare starting just from there, right? And so the observational studies are always trying to account for those variables. They have analyses, statistical analyses that are meant to account for that, but they can never fully account for those things. And they also can't account for things that they don't know are factors, right? So it's like a version of you don't know what you don't know. And that again is one of the challenges of the observational study, even if the observational study allows us to explore questions that we wouldn't otherwise be able to explore. It's like you get one with the other.
Totally. And then I think our final sort of point of discussion on this one was that there was a substitution analysis. So we have talked a lot about this in all of these nutrition studies we've looked at, right? That like if you're not eating something, you're replacing it with something else. So that needs to be accounted for. They did it in sort of maybe not our first choice way in this one, where they substituted for the same gram amount. So they didn't keep it like the same calories or the same macros, right? They didn't say like, we're going to replace your high fat cheese that has this amount of fat with the same calories with this amount of fat, but the fat's going to be different so we can see what it's doing. Like it wasn't like that, which we sort of wished it had been. So they didn't do that, but they did see that like when you subbed in the high fat cheese, you were probably replacing it with, I'm saying this all backwards. You took out processed meats. So you would like maybe like you'd have high fat cheese that would be satisfying. So you're having less processed meat or less high fat meat. And that was good, right? Like having the cheese in there helped reduce some of the intake of those other things. So maybe that's what we're seeing in that substitution analysis.
Yeah. So that was like the theory that came out of that, because the substitution analysis said, yeah, if we replace 20 grams of high fat cheese with 20 grams of processed meat, we see an increased risk in dementia. And so there were a couple of things like that, but the processed meat certainly stood out. And so the theory was, again, there may not, because we can't make these sort of conclusions from this study. There may not be anything special about the cheese per se, but if you're eating the cheese instead of the salami, no picking on salami, but like the processed meats, right? In this, because of the substitution analysis results, if you're eating that high fat cheese, it's salty, it's satisfying, and yeah, if you were doing that instead of having salami or more salami, and you did that repeatedly, that you might see this risk reduction in dementia, because the high fat cheese was a better choice in this comparison than to the processed meat, or as you said before, it's the like least bad, right? In that context. And so, but we don't know enough about the cheese to say, is that just what could be going on here, or is there something special about the cheese? But we do love a substitution analysis, even if the like gram to gram conversation doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense here. But as I was thinking about it, I also understand now that maybe doing the like fat to fat, or like the macro comparison, may not be that helpful either, because we don't know what it is about the high fat cheese.
Yes.
But like a caloric comparison would have been nice. So it's like if you're doing 200 calories worth of cheese versus 200 calories versus processed foods, that would have felt maybe more akin to like how this comes together, as opposed to like grams weight, right? But or like typical serving sizes. Maybe that's it. Maybe I was just like, I would have liked a typical serving size comparison.
Totally. Because we also get, back to our first point, like, or one of our points up there at the top was like 50 grams is a tiny amount of cheese, right? Like it almost feels like you're like making dinner and you're grazing on a piece of cheese. And then all of a sudden you decide to graze on something else. Like, is that massively different? I don't know. Like in real world application, it feels like these tiny, tiny amounts aren't shifting the needle in big, significant ways or in ways that feel super clinically meaningful, right? Like at the end of the day, I don't know that 50 grams of anything is going to make or break a diet aside from butter. Might be one I would actually hang my hat on.
Yeah. And in particular, if you were trying to mitigate saturated fats impact on things like cholesterol levels, heart disease risk, and some of the other things that we've explored for the link between saturated fat. But you're right, 50 grams of most things aren't going to make that much of a difference.
Yeah. So I think like clinically for us, it felt like this was just less exciting than the headline, right? Like we didn't go into it anti-cheese to be fully transparent, but yeah, like the effect is neutral. There might be a positive. It also comes in the context that the MIND diet, which is a well-researched like Mediterranean like pattern for dementia and cognitive decline, actually excludes cheese. So it's sort of in tension of that conversation. Like, is it because of the saturated fat? Is there maybe something about the cheese that is less harmful? If we leave it out, are we creating harm? We don't have an answer to that. It's very neutral at this point from what we can see. Is there added benefit? Maybe would be my answer there.
Yeah, and we're just like, I guess TBD, check back again in 5 years. The joy of science, right? Like when you see these studies that are sort of interesting, exciting, or frustrating, and you think, okay, well, what is the answer here? And then you go, oh, well, we're like one step further than we were, but we still have to wait how this all shakes out. Wait to see how this all shakes out, and that's why you have to be not suspicious, but just a little skeptical of like big fancy headlines.
Totally. Yeah, because this one, like, it wasn't inaccurate, but I don't think it lived up to the hype. And maybe on the charcuterie board, right? We sort of joked, right? Like, you choose the cheese over the processed meat, or like reduce your processed meats a little bit, and you can indulge in the cheese. It is satiating and delicious and a nice, like, sensory taste experience. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, and a source of like more nutrients, especially a hard-fought calcium, which many people don't necessarily get enough of, right? So,
yeah. So I think that probably ties this one
I
up.
think so too.
Yeah, so good to chat with you.
Cheese to you, Antonella.
Cheese to you.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Bye.